In the spring of 1997, Daniel Mercer and his 12-year-old son, Ethan, disappeared without a trace from their remote cattle farm in Brazos County, Texas. No bodies were ever found. No ransom was demanded. The investigation went cold within months. But 26 years later, when a restoration crew began tearing down the old Mercer farmhouse, they discovered something in the walls that made seasoned investigators physically ill. What they found didn't just reopen a decades-old missing persons case. It revealed that Daniel and Ethan Mercer's final hours were far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. If you're drawn to unsolved mysteries and the dark secrets that hide in plain sight, subscribe now, because some disappearances are worse than death. The last confirmed sighting of Daniel Mercer alive came from Chester Rainey, a neighboring rancher who'd stopped by Crow's Hollow Farm on the evening of April 14, 1997, to return a borrowed post-hole digger. Chester would later tell investigators that Daniel had seemed distracted, almost agitated, standing in the doorway of the barn, rather than inviting him inside as was customary. When Chester asked if everything was all right, Daniel had glanced back over his shoulder into the darkness of the barn and said something that would haunt Chester for the rest of his life. "Sometimes the land takes back what it's owed." Chester had laughed nervously, assuming Daniel was making some cryptic joke about the drought that had plagued the region. He left the tool leaning against the barn and drove away, watching in his rearview mirror as Daniel remained silhouetted in that doorway, unmoving, staring into the barn's black interior. That was 7 o'clock on a Monday evening. By Wednesday morning, when Daniel failed to show up for a livestock auction he'd never missed in 15 years, his sister Patricia drove out to the farm. She found the house unlocked, breakfast dishes still on the table, Daniel's truck parked in its usual spot. Ethan's school books were scattered across his bedroom floor. Both of their wallets, keys, and identification remained in the house. But Daniel and Ethan were gone. And in the barn, someone had painted a symbol on the dirt floor in what testing would later confirm was cattle blood. A circle with radiating lines, like a child's drawing of the sun, though the deputies who saw it said it felt nothing like sunshine. It felt like a door opening onto something that should have stayed closed. The call came to Detective Sarah Bridgewater on a Tuesday morning in October 2023, just as she was finishing her second cup of coffee in the Brazos County Sheriff's Department break room. 20 years on the force had taught her to read the quality of silence on a phone line, and what she heard when she answered made her set down her mug with deliberate care. "Detective Bridgewater, this is Marcus Webb with Webb & Sons Demolition. We've got a situation out at the old Mercer property on County Road 47. You're going to want to see this in person." Sarah had lived in Brazos County her entire life. She knew the Mercer farm, though it had stood abandoned for more than 2 decades, slowly being reclaimed by the Texas scrubland. She also knew the story. Every local did. The father and son who'd vanished like smoke, leaving behind a mystery that had consumed the sheriff's department for 2 futile years before finally being relegated to the cold case files. "What kind of situation, Mr. Webb?" The demolition contractor's breathing sounded unsteady. "We were pulling down interior walls in the main house, standard procedure before we bring in the heavy equipment. We found something inside one of the walls, between the studs." He paused, and Sarah heard him swallow hard. "Ma'am, I've been in this business 30 years. I've seen a lot of strange things in old houses. But this is different." 40 minutes later, Sarah's department SUV turned onto the long dirt road leading to Crow's Hollow Farm. The property spread across 200 acres of dried grassland, bisected by a creek that had run dry every summer for the past decade. The farmhouse itself sat on a slight rise, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch that had once been the pride of the Mercer family. 2 demolition trucks were parked in the circular drive, along with a rusted sedan that presumably belonged to Marcus Webb. Sarah climbed out into air that smelled of dust and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that she couldn't quite place. 3 men stood near the front porch, and from their body language, none of them wanted to go back inside. Marcus Webb was in his 50s, built like a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor, but his face had the pale, clammy look of someone fighting nausea. He approached Sarah with visible relief. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly. Show me what you found." Webb led her up the porch steps, several of which groaned ominously under their weight. The front door stood open, and Sarah could see where the demolition crew had already begun their work. The foyer's wallpaper hung in strips, and a sledgehammer leaned against the staircase banister. "We were working on the upstairs," Webb explained, his voice echoing in the empty house. "Master bedroom, specifically. The previous owner, the one who bought it at auction back in 2003, tried to renovate but gave up after a few months. Never lived here. Most people say the place has bad energy." Sarah had heard those rumors. In small Texas towns, abandoned properties collected ghost stories the way they collected dust. They climbed the stairs, and with each step, that organic smell grew stronger. Not quite rot, but something preserved, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. At the top of the landing, Webb paused. "Before we go in, I need to tell you. My crew, they're good men. They've worked sites where we found evidence of crimes, drug manufacturing, things like that. But when Luis opened up that wall, he dropped his crowbar and walked straight out to his truck. He's still sitting there." "What's in the wall, Mr. Webb?" He didn't answer, just led her to the master bedroom doorway. The room had been partially demolished, exposing the wooden studs beneath decades-old plaster and wallpaper. A section of the exterior wall had been opened up, creating a gap about 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. And there, in the cavity between the studs, illuminated by a work light someone had set up, was a space that shouldn't have existed. Someone had built a false wall, creating a hidden compartment roughly the size of a small closet. The interior had been painstakingly lined with what looked like aluminum foil, every surface covered, reflecting the work light in 1,000 fractured gleams. But that wasn't what made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The compartment was filled with photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, attached to the foil-covered walls with what appeared to be straight pins. And every single photograph was of the same person. Ethan Mercer, 12 years old. Frozen in time at the age he'd been when he disappeared. Sarah pulled on latex gloves from the kit she kept in her vehicle, her hands steady despite the cold finger of dread working its way up her spine. She'd called for backup and the crime scene unit, but that would take at least 40 minutes. The old Mercer farm sat far enough from town that response times had always been slow. Marcus Webb and his crew waited downstairs, grateful to be dismissed from the scene. Sarah stood alone in the doorway of the master bedroom, studying the hidden compartment before she entered. The work light cast harsh shadows across the aluminum foil lining, making the space seem to pulse and breathe. She took her first photograph with her phone, documenting the scene from the doorway. Then she stepped closer, her boots crunching on plaster debris. The pictures of Ethan weren't just snapshots. They appeared to be surveillance photographs, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Ethan walking to the school bus. Ethan helping his father mend a fence. Ethan reading on the front porch. Ethan sleeping in his bed, visible through his bedroom window. That last category was the most disturbing. There were dozens of photos of Ethan asleep, all taken from outside, through his window, at night. Sarah's jaw tightened as she counted them. 47 photographs of a child sleeping, unaware he was being watched. The pins holding the photos created a pattern, she realized. Not random placement, but deliberate organization. The photos appeared to be arranged chronologically, creating a timeline that spiraled inward toward the center of the hidden space. Sarah followed the spiral with her eyes, watching Ethan age backward from 12 to what looked like maybe 7 or 8 years old. At the very center of the spiral, where the timeline ended, someone had carved words directly into the foil-covered drywall beneath. The letters were crude, scratched deep. He chose wrong. Below those words, pinned with 4 straight pins like a specimen, was a photograph Sarah recognized from the missing persons file. It was the family portrait that had run in newspapers across Texas during the investigation. Daniel Mercer stood behind his son, one hand on Ethan's shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera. Patricia Mercer had provided that photo to the media, but this copy had been altered. Someone had used a razor blade to carefully cut Daniel's face out of the photograph, leaving only a ragged hole where his features should have been. Ethan's image remained untouched. Sarah heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside. Backup was arriving early. She took several more photographs with her phone, then carefully backed out of the room, her mind already cataloging questions. Who had built this hidden compartment? When? And most importantly, had they done it before the disappearance or after? Sheriff Raymond Torres was the first through the front door, his weathered face grim. He'd been a deputy 26 years ago when Daniel and Ethan vanished, and Sarah knew this case had haunted him throughout his career. "Tell me," he said simply. Sarah led him upstairs and watched his expression harden as he took in the hidden compartment. Torres had served in the army before becoming a lawman, had seen his share of horrors, but this clearly disturbed him. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "all this time this was here. We searched this house 3 times during the original investigation." "It's a professional job," Sarah observed. "Whoever built that false wall knew what they were doing. Even looking at it from this angle, you can barely tell it's not original construction. If the demolition crew hadn't opened it up, it might never have been found." The sheriff moved closer, his trained eyes scanning the photographs. These were taken over years. The oldest ones show Ethan as a young child. "Someone was watching him for a long time before the disappearance," Sarah said, "which changes the nature of this case entirely. This wasn't a spontaneous crime or a random abduction. This was planned, obsessive." Torres pointed to the carved message. "He chose wrong. What does that mean?" "I don't know, but I think we need to re-interview everyone connected to the original investigation, starting with Patricia Mercer." The sheriff nodded slowly. "She still lives in town. Never married, never moved away. She's been waiting 26 years for answers." He turned to look at Sarah, and she saw the weight of those decades in his eyes. "We're going to have to tell her we found something. We're going to have to show her this." Sarah thought of those surveillance photos, the obsessive documentation of a child's daily life, the disturbing intimacy of the images taken through bedroom windows. She needs to know. But, "Raymond, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Someone built this shrine. Someone carved that message, and I don't think they're finished telling their story." As if in response, the house settled with a long, groaning creak that sounded almost like words. Outside, the Texas wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the old farmhouse. And in the hidden compartment, the aluminum foil lining caught the work light and threw back 1,000 fractured reflections of Ethan Mercer's face, watching them with frozen, innocent eyes. Patricia Mercer still lived in the same house where she'd grown up, a modest ranch-style home on the eastern edge of Brazos County. Sarah had called ahead, giving her just enough information to prepare her, but not enough to cause panic. When Patricia opened the door that afternoon, Sarah saw a woman who'd been preserved in grief like an insect in amber. She was 53 now, but her eyes held the same haunted quality they'd had in news footage from 1997. "You found something," Patricia said before Sarah could speak. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the flat certainty of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for half her life. They sat in Patricia's living room, surrounded by photographs of Daniel and Ethan that had never been taken down. A shrine of a different kind, Sarah thought, though one built from love rather than obsession. "We discovered a hidden compartment in the farmhouse," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. "Inside were photographs of Ethan, many photographs taken over several years." Patricia's hands tightened around the coffee mug she held. "What kind of photographs?" "Surveillance photos. Someone was watching him, documenting his daily activities. Some were taken through his bedroom window at night." The mug slipped from Patricia's fingers, coffee spreading across the carpet in a dark stain. She didn't seem to notice. Oh God, someone was watching him. All that time, someone was watching my nephew." Sarah retrieved paper towels from the kitchen and knelt to blot the spill, giving Patricia a moment to collect herself. When she returned to her seat, Patricia had wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," Sarah said gently. "About the time before the disappearance. Did Ethan ever mention feeling watched? Did he seem frightened or anxious?" Patricia shook her head slowly. He was a normal boy, happy. He loved that farm, loved working alongside Daniel. They were so close, especially after Caroline died. She looked up at Sarah. "Daniel's wife, Ethan's mother. She passed when Ethan was 6. Cancer. After that, it was just the two of them." "Tell me about Daniel. What was he like in the weeks before the disappearance?" For the first time, Patricia hesitated. Her eyes drifted to a photograph on the mantel showing Daniel and Ethan standing beside a tractor, both squinting into the sun. "He changed," she said, finally. "About 3 months before they vanished, maybe 4, he became paranoid, started saying strange things." Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of strange things?" "He thought someone was coming onto the property at night. He'd wake up and find things moved around, tools in different places than where he'd left them, gates that he knew he'd closed standing open. He set up motion sensor lights around the house and barn." Patricia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He bought a gun. Daniel had never owned a gun in his life. He didn't believe in them, but he bought one and kept it in his nightstand." "Did he report any of this to the police?" "He tried. Called the sheriff's office twice about trespassers, but they never found any evidence. No footprints, no tire tracks. The deputies thought he was imagining things, maybe stress from running the farm alone." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I thought so too. I told him he was working too hard, that grief does things to people's minds. I didn't believe him." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Patricia a photograph she'd taken of the carved message in the hidden compartment. "Does the phrase, 'he chose wrong,' mean anything to you?" Patricia studied the image, her face growing pale. "Daniel did make a choice. About a month before they disappeared, someone approached him about selling the farm, a company called Brazos Land Development. They offered him 3 times what the property was worth. That's a significant offer. Daniel turned them down flat, said the farm had been in the Mercer family for 4 generations, said Ethan deserved to inherit something that mattered, something with roots. The land agent was furious. He came back twice more, each time increasing the offer. The 3rd time, Daniel threatened to call the police if he ever showed up again." Sarah felt the familiar tingle of a lead developing. "Do you remember the land agent's name?" Patricia closed her eyes, concentrating. "Thomas something. Thomas Wicklow, maybe?" "No, Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore. He gave Daniel a business card, but Daniel threw it away. I remember because I fished it out of the trash after he left. I thought Daniel was being foolish, turning down that kind of money." She looked at Sarah with something like shame. "I still have it. The card. I kept it in case I ever needed to contact them about selling after Daniel was declared legally dead. 5 minutes later, Sarah held a faded business card in her gloved hand. Brazos Land Development Corporation. Thomas Whitmore, Senior Acquisitions Agent. The address listed was in Houston, with a phone number that used an older area code format. Ms. Mercer, I need to ask you about the barn. When you found the house empty, you also found a symbol painted on the barn floor. Do you remember it clearly? Patricia shuddered. I'll never forget it. A circle with lines radiating out. The deputies took photos, but they couldn't figure out what it meant. Some kind of occult symbol, they thought. Or maybe just vandalism. Did Daniel ever talk about symbols, strange markings, anything like that? No, but... Patricia paused, her brow furrowing. There was something. The week before they disappeared, Ethan told me about a game he and his father had been playing. He called it sun drawing. He said they'd been making sun pictures in different places around the farm. Sarah's pulse quickened. What kind of sun pictures? He showed me one, in the dirt behind the chicken coop, just a circle with lines radiating out like a child's drawing of the sun. I thought it was sweet, you know? Father and son making art together. I didn't think anything of it. Patricia's voice broke. I didn't think it meant anything. Sarah drove back to the station as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and red. Her mind worked through the pieces. Surveillance photos spanning years, a rejected land deal, Daniel's paranoia about trespassers, and symbols, sun symbols, that Daniel and Ethan had been creating in the days before they vanished. She needed to find Thomas Whitmore. She needed to understand what Brazos Land Development had really wanted with Crow's Hollow Farm. And she needed to figure out what those symbols meant, because something told her they weren't just innocent games between a father and son. They were messages, or warnings, or perhaps something far worse. The Brazos County Sheriff's Department had converted an old storage room into a cold case workspace years ago, and by Wednesday morning it had been transformed into a command center for the Mercer investigation. Sarah stood before a corkboard covered with photographs, timeline markers, and questions written in red marker. Sheriff Torres sat at the conference table, reading through the original case files that had been pulled from archives. The phone number on Whitmore's business card is disconnected, Sarah reported, setting down her coffee. The address in Houston is now a parking garage. Brazos Land Development Corporation dissolved in 2001, 4 years after the Mercers disappeared. Torres looked up from the file. Convenient timing. I've got the State Archive Office pulling their corporate filings. We should have a list of officers and registered agents by this afternoon. Sarah pinned the business card to the corkboard. But I did some preliminary research. Brazos Land Development was a subsidiary of a larger company called Meridian Holdings. And Meridian Holdings has an interesting history. She added a printout to the board showing a corporate family tree. Between 1989 and 2003, Meridian acquired over 40 properties across central Texas. Rural properties, mostly farms and ranches. They'd make aggressive offers, usually well above market value. If the owners refused, strange things would start happening. What kind of strange things? Livestock deaths, equipment failures. In 3 cases, the properties experienced well contamination that made them nearly worthless. Sarah circled several names on the list. Within 18 months of refusing Meridian's offers, every single one of these property owners either sold or declared bankruptcy. Torres set down the file folder. You're saying this was systematic intimidation? I'm saying it's a pattern, and the Mercer farm fits that pattern perfectly. Aggressive offer, rejection, followed by Daniel's paranoia about trespassers, and then the disappearance. She paused. Except in the Mercer case, they didn't just lose their property. They lost their lives. That's a significant escalation. We need to find Thomas Whitmore. Already working on it. I've got requests out to DMV, credit bureaus, and social media searches. Sarah turned back to the board. But there's something else. I went through the original investigation photos last night, the ones showing that symbol in the barn. She pinned up an 8x10 photograph showing the circle with radiating lines, painted in cattle blood on the barn's dirt floor. The deputies assumed this was left by whoever took Daniel and Ethan, but according to Patricia, Ethan told her he and Daniel had been drawing sun pictures around the farm. You think Daniel painted this? His own son told Patricia it was a game? Maybe it started as a game, or maybe Daniel was trying to communicate something. Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a folder of images she'd compiled. I spent 3 hours last night researching symbolic systems, religious iconography, occult symbols, Native American pictographs. This specific symbol, a circle with exactly 7 radiating lines, appears in several different contexts. She displayed the first image. In some esoteric traditions, it represents a gateway or threshold, a boundary between worlds. The next image. In certain protection rituals, it's used as a seal to prevent something from crossing over. The third image. And in at least one obscure reference I found in a folklore database, 7 pointed sun symbols were associated with land rights and territorial claims among certain settler communities in the 1800s. Torres studied the images with a deepening frown. Are you suggesting Daniel was performing some kind of ritual? I'm suggesting he might have believed he needed protection. Think about it. He's experiencing paranoia, thinks someone is trespassing on his property, refuses to sell despite increasingly aggressive offers. What if he started researching ways to protect his land? What if he found something in local history or folklore that made him think these symbols would help? That's a lot of speculation, Detective. I know, but it explains why he and Ethan were drawing these symbols around the property, and why the largest, most prominent one was in the barn. Sarah pulled up the crime scene photo again. This wasn't left by an intruder. This was Daniel's last act before the disappearance. He painted this symbol, and then he and Ethan vanished. The sheriff's desk phone rang, cutting through the tension. He answered, listened for a moment, then held the receiver toward Sarah. It's the crime scene unit. They found something else at the farmhouse. Sarah took the phone. Bridgewater. Detective, this is Chen. We've been processing the hidden compartment, cataloging all the photographs. We found something tucked behind the insulation in the back corner. A notebook. Looks like a journal. Sarah's grip tightened on the receiver. Have you read it? Enough to know you need to get out here. Detective, whoever wrote this was documenting the surveillance. There are entries going back to 1991, 6 years before the disappearance. Sarah was back at Crow's Hollow Farm within 30 minutes, Torres following in his own vehicle. The crime scene unit had set up a processing station in what had once been the dining room, and forensic technician James Chen met them at the door wearing fresh gloves and an expression that told Sarah the news wasn't good. The journal was a standard composition notebook, the kind sold in any drugstore. The cover was warped with age and moisture, but the pages inside had been protected by the sealed environment of the hidden compartment. Chen had placed it in a clear evidence bag on the dining room table. We'll need to process it properly for fingerprints and DNA, Chen said, but I thought you should see the contents before we seal it up. Sarah pulled on gloves and carefully opened the bag, extracting the notebook. The first entry was dated March 3, 1991, written in neat, precise handwriting. Subject acquired. Age 6 years, 4 months. Baseline observation period begins. Target demonstrates standard developmental markers. Attachment to primary guardian, father, is strong, possibly excessive following maternal death. This bond will be useful. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She turned the page. March 17, 1991. Subject observed during outdoor play. Demonstrates creativity and imagination. Drew pictures in the dirt behind residence. Father encouraged this behavior. Natural artistic inclination noted. April 2, 1991. Successfully accessed property during father's absence. Confirmed bedroom location. Window lock is simple, easily compromised. Subject sleeps deeply, approximately 8.5 hours per night. Vulnerable. Page after page documented Ethan's life with clinical detachment. His daily routines, his fears, his habits. The journal writer had been inside the house multiple times, had stood in Ethan's bedroom while he slept, had photographed him through windows and from hidden positions around the property. Sarah reached an entry dated February 1997, 2 months before the disappearance. Father is becoming aware. He senses observation but cannot confirm. He searches but does not find. He will find nothing because I am patient, I am careful, I have been preparing for 6 years. Subject is nearly ready, age 12 is optimal. Young enough for malleability, old enough for comprehension. Father will resist. This is expected. He loves the boy. But he does not understand what the boy is meant for. He does not understand the purpose. The final entry was dated April 13, 1997. 1 day before the disappearance, tomorrow. Father has completed the symbols, thinking they protect. He does not understand they are invitations. The seals do not keep things out, they call things in. He has marked the thresholds. He has opened the way. Tomorrow I will show the Father what he has done. Tomorrow I will give him a choice. And when he chooses wrong, as he will, the boy becomes mine. The land becomes mine. Everything becomes mine, as it was always meant to be. They will never find the bodies. They will never understand what happened. But I will know, and in the knowing, I will be complete. Sarah closed the journal with trembling hands. Torres stood beside her, his face ashen. "Sweet Jesus," the sheriff whispered. "This is a confession." "This is a hunting log," Sarah corrected, her voice hard. "Whoever wrote this spent 6 years stalking a child, and then they took him." She looked up at Chen. "We need handwriting analysis. We need to cross-reference this with every person who had access to that property. Every worker, every neighbor, every business associate." "And Thomas Whitmore," Torres added. "We need to find him now." Sarah stared down at the journal through the clear evidence bag. 6 years of surveillance, 6 years of planning, and then a cryptic reference to the father choosing wrong, to the symbols being invitations rather than protection. What choice had Daniel been given? And what had he done that sealed both their fates? The break came at 3 a.m. on Thursday, when Sarah was still at her desk, working through cross-referenced databases. Her phone rang with a call from the State Archive Office, where a researcher named Monica Chen had been working overtime at Sarah's request. "Detective Bridgewater, I found something on Meridian Holdings you need to hear." Sarah sat up straighter, fatigue temporarily forgotten. "Go ahead." "I pulled corporate filings going back to Meridian's founding in 1987. The company had 3 primary officers listed. The CEO was a man named Robert Carthage, who died in 2015. The CFO was Ellen Morse, current whereabouts unknown, and the director of land acquisition was Thomas Whitmore. I already knew Whitmore worked for them." "Yes, but what you didn't know is that Thomas Whitmore legally changed his name in 2002. He's now Thomas Mercer." Sarah's blood went cold. Mercer. As in, I cross-referenced birth records. Thomas Whitmore was born in 1961 in Brazos County. His mother was Helen Whitmore. His father was Michael Mercer, Daniel Mercer's uncle. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas Whitmore and Daniel Mercer were cousins. Second cousins, technically. And there's more. I found a probate record from 1959. The original Crows. Hollow Farm was left to 3 heirs when the patriarch died. It was divided equally between 3 brothers: Robert Mercer, who was Daniel's grandfather, Michael Mercer, who was Thomas's grandfather, and James Mercer, who died without heirs in 1963. So Thomas Whitmore believed he had a claim to the property. More than believed. According to the probate documents, there was a dispute. Michael Mercer argued that since James died without children, his third of the property should be redistributed. But the will was ironclad. James's portion went to Robert's line, which eventually passed to Daniel. Michael's family got nothing. Sarah thought of the carved message in the hidden compartment. He chose wrong. When Meridian Holdings approached Daniel about selling, they weren't just making a business offer. Thomas was trying to reclaim what he thought should have been his family's inheritance. And when Daniel refused, Thomas took matters into his own hands. After hanging up with Monica, Sarah immediately began searching for Thomas Mercer. It took 2 hours and several database queries, but she finally found him. He was living in Brazos County, had been the entire time, just 23 miles from the farm he'd obsessed over for decades. The address was a rural property off Farm Road 159, a small ranch house set back from the road. Sarah waited until dawn before calling Sheriff Torres with the news. By 8 in the morning, they were coordinating with a tactical team. Thomas Mercer wasn't just a person of interest in a cold case anymore. The journal found in the hidden compartment was enough to establish probable cause for arrest. They surrounded the property at 9:15. Sarah wore a bulletproof vest under her jacket, her service weapon holstered at her hip. Torres led the approach to the front door while deputies covered the back and sides of the house. The man who answered the door looked nothing like Sarah had imagined. Thomas Mercer was 62, balding, with a soft face and the beginnings of a paunch. He wore reading glasses and a cardigan sweater. He looked like someone's kindly uncle, not a man who'd spent 6 years stalking a child. "Thomas Mercer?" Torres said, his hand resting on his weapon. "Yes?" Thomas blinked behind his glasses, appearing genuinely confused. "Can I help you?" "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearances of Daniel Mercer and Ethan Mercer in April 1997. For just a moment, something flickered across Thomas's face. Not surprise, not fear, something that looked almost like relief. Then it was gone, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. "I wondered when someone would figure it out," he said quietly. "I've been waiting a long time." They brought him to the station and placed him in an interrogation room. Sarah and Torres let him sit for 30 minutes while they conferred, reviewing their evidence and planning their approach. When they finally entered the room, Thomas sat calmly at the table, his hands folded in front of him. Sarah placed the journal, still in its evidence bag, on the table between them. "This is your handwriting, isn't it?" Thomas looked at the notebook without touching it. "I wrote that 26 years ago. I was a different person then. You stalked a child for 6 years. I observed him. There's a difference. You took photographs of him sleeping. You broke into his home. I needed to understand him, to know if he was worthy." Thomas looked up at Sarah, and she saw something unsettling in his eyes. Not madness, but absolute certainty. "The land chooses, Detective. The land has always chosen. It chose the Mercer line, and I needed to know if Ethan Mercer would honor that choice or squander it like his father did." Torres leaned forward. "Where are they, Thomas? Where are Daniel and Ethan?" "That depends on your definition of where." Thomas smiled slightly. "Daniel made his choice. I gave him an option. Sell me the farm, leave with his son, start a new life somewhere else, or refuse and face the consequences. He refused. So you killed them." "I didn't kill anyone." Thomas's voice remained calm, almost serene. I simply allowed the land to take back what it was owed. Daniel thought his symbols would protect him. He'd been reading about folk magic, about protective circles and seals. He was terrified, you see. He knew someone was watching, even if he couldn't prove it. So he started drawing those symbols, those sun circles, all around the property. He thought they were wards. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What were they, really? Invitations? Calls? Summons? Thomas leaned back in his chair. The land underneath Crow's Hollow Farm is old, Detective. Older than Texas, older than America, older than any name we've given it. There are places where the ground is thin, where something else presses against our world. The original Mercer, who claimed that land in 1847, he knew. He built the farm on one of those thin places deliberately. As long as the Mercers tended the land, honored it, the boundary held. But Daniel was weak. He wanted to abandon it, to leave. So you convinced him his protective symbols would actually open a door. I didn't have to convince him of anything. I just had to wait. On April 14th, the night before they disappeared, I went to the farm. I found Daniel in the barn, standing in the center of the symbol he'd painted. He'd completed the ritual without even understanding what he was doing. 7 symbols around the property, all pointing inward, all focusing on that one spot in the barn. Thomas's eyes grew distant, remembering. I told him the truth then. I told him what he'd done. The look on his face when he realized was exquisite. I gave him the choice one last time. Sign over the deed, and I would break the seals, close the door he'd opened. He could take Ethan and leave. But he refused, Sarah said. He attacked me. He actually tried to kill me, there in the barn. We fought, and I managed to escape. I got in my car and drove away. When I came back the next morning, they were gone. The barn was empty except for that symbol on the floor. Daniel and Ethan had simply vanished. Torres slammed his hand on the table. You expect us to believe some supernatural story? You killed them and disposed of the bodies. Thomas smiled, a cold expression that made Sarah's skin crawl. Then search, Sheriff. Search the entire property. Use ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, whatever technology you have. You won't find them, because they're not dead. They're just somewhere else. Despite Thomas Mercer's claims, Sheriff Torres ordered a comprehensive search of both Crow's Hollow Farm and Thomas's current property. Cadaver dogs were brought in, along with ground-penetrating radar equipment and a forensic team that spent 3 days systematically examining every inch of both locations. They found nothing. No bodies, no burial sites, no evidence of violence beyond the journal and photographs in the hidden compartment. Sarah sat in her office on the 4th day of the search, reviewing Thomas's interrogation transcript for the dozenth time. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court had come back inconclusive. Thomas displayed no signs of psychosis, no delusional thinking, no markers of severe mental illness. He was simply a man who believed absolutely in what he was saying. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Elizabeth Oakes, a forensic anthropologist from Texas A&M who'd been consulting on the case. Detective Bridgewater, I've been researching the history of the Mercer property, and I found something you need to see. An hour later, Dr. Oakes sat across from Sarah's desk, spreading out photocopied documents and old maps. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who spent her professional life studying death. I started with the assumption that Thomas Mercer, for all his supernatural claims, was still operating from a basis in reality, Dr. Oakes explained. So I researched the history of Crow's Hollow Farm, going back to when it was first settled. She pointed to a survey map from 1847. The land was claimed by Jedediah Mercer, a settler from Missouri. According to county records, he built the original farmhouse in 1848. But here's what's interesting. I found newspaper articles from that period, and Jedediah Mercer had a reputation. Sarah leaned forward. What kind of reputation? He was known as a dowser, someone who could locate water sources, but the local Cherokee who were still in the area at the time warned settlers to avoid him. They said he didn't find water. He found doors. Doors to what? Dr. Oakes pulled out a fragile, yellowed newspaper clipping from 1851. According to this article from the Brazos County Gazette, 3 separate families tried to purchase land adjacent to Mercer's farm. All 3 reported strange occurrences: livestock going missing, objects moving on their own. One family's youngest daughter vanished from her bed one night and was found 3 days later wandering in the woods, unable to speak. The Cherokee had a name for the area where Crow's Hollow sits. They called it the place where the world is soft. Their oral traditions spoke of certain locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world was permeable. They performed specific rituals to keep those boundaries sealed. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. What kind of rituals? Offerings, mainly. Tobacco, corn, animal sacrifice in some cases. But the key element was that someone had to actively tend the boundary. It required regular attention, regular intention. If that attention stopped, if the guardian abandoned their post, the boundary would weaken. Dr. Oakes spread out more documents. I found Mercer family records going back 6 generations. In every generation, one member of the family lived on the farm continuously. They never all left at once. Someone was always there, tending the land. Until Daniel. What do you mean? 3 months before the disappearance, Daniel took Ethan on a week-long trip to Dallas. His sister Patricia confirmed it. It was the first time in over 150 years that the farm stood completely empty for more than 24 hours. Sarah thought of Thomas's journal, of the entries documenting Daniel's growing paranoia after that trip. You're saying something changed when they came back. I'm saying Daniel felt something had changed. Whether that was psychological or something more, I can't tell you. But his behavior shifted. He became obsessed with protecting the property. He researched folk traditions and protective symbols. The 7-pointed sun circles. Dr. Oakes nodded. Which appear in multiple cultural contexts, but specifically in some Native American traditions as threshold markers. Not to keep things out, but to mark transitions between spaces. Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the darkening Texas sky. So either Daniel accidentally opened some kind of doorway through ritual symbols, or Thomas Mercer orchestrated an elaborate psychological manipulation that convinced Daniel he had, creating enough fear and confusion to facilitate murder. There's a third option, Dr. Oakes said quietly, which is that Thomas believed the supernatural explanation completely and acted on that belief in ways we haven't yet discovered. Belief is a powerful thing, Detective. People have committed terrible acts throughout history because they believed they were serving some higher purpose or accessing some greater power. After Dr. Oakes left, Sarah sat alone in her office as night fell. She thought about Ethan Mercer, 12 years old, scared because his father was acting strangely. She thought about Daniel, a widower trying to raise his son alone, becoming convinced that something was hunting them. And she thought about Thomas, spending 6 years watching, waiting, documenting, planning something. Her phone buzzed with a text from the crime scene unit. They'd finished processing Thomas's current residence and found a basement that Thomas had failed to mention during questioning. Sarah immediately called Torres and drove to the property, arriving just after 10 in the evening. The basement was accessed through a door in the kitchen that Thomas had concealed behind a bookshelf. The stairs descended into darkness, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she followed a forensic technician down the steps. The basement had been converted into a study of sorts. The walls were covered with maps, all centered on Crow's Hollow Farm. There were geological surveys, water table charts, and something that looked like ley line maps, showing supposed lines of energy crisscrossing the landscape. But what drew Sarah's attention was the far wall. It was covered in photographs, just like the hidden compartment at the farmhouse. Except these photos weren't of Ethan. They were of the farm itself, taken at different times over decades, and in each photo, standing in various locations around the property, was a figure. The same figure in every photo, though the photos clearly spanned years based on the changes in vegetation and buildings. A man, tall and thin, always photographed from behind or at an angle that obscured his face. Sometimes near the barn, sometimes by the creek, sometimes standing at the edge of the property line. Sarah looked closer at one of the photos, taken in what appeared to be the 1970s based on the quality and color saturation. The figure stood beside a fence post, and though his face wasn't visible, his posture suggested he was looking toward the farmhouse. "We found this too," the forensic technician said, handing Sarah a notebook. Not a journal this time, but a ledger. Inside were dates and times, going back to 1989, each entry marking a sighting. June 3, 1989, 11:47 p.m., figure observed near barn, no physical interaction. September 17, 1991, 2:33 a.m., figure observed at property boundary, appeared to be testing the line. March 8, 1995, 4:15 a.m., figure observed outside subject's bedroom window, first time inside inner perimeter. The entries continued, becoming more frequent as they approached April 1997. The final entry was dated April 15, 1997, the day after Daniel and Ethan disappeared. April 15, 1997, 6:22 a.m., boundary breached, figures multiple, including subject and father. They passed through. Door closed. The land has taken its due. My family's claim is satisfied. Sarah stared at the words. Figures multiple. Thomas claimed he hadn't seen Daniel and Ethan die. He claimed they'd simply vanished, passed through some impossible doorway. And he'd apparently seen something, or thought he'd seen something, that confirmed his belief. The question was whether Thomas had created an elaborate delusion to justify murder, or whether something else had happened at Crow's Hollow Farm on April 15, 1997. Something that defied conventional explanation. Thomas Mercer refused to cooperate further. His attorney advised him to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but Thomas rejected the advice. He insisted he was completely sane, that everything he'd done was justified, and that Daniel and Ethan Mercer were not dead, but simply somewhere else. The district attorney charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, despite the absence of bodies. The journal, the photographs, the documented stalking, and the basement shrine were deemed sufficient evidence of premeditation and malice. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. Sarah, however, couldn't let it rest. Something about the case gnawed at her, particularly the photographs Thomas had taken of the mysterious figure on the farm. She'd shown them to imaging specialists, who confirmed the photos hadn't been doctored. Someone or something had been on that property, photographed repeatedly over decades. On a cold November morning, Sarah returned to Crow's Hollow Farm alone. The demolition had been halted pending the criminal trial, and the property sat in eerie silence. She walked the perimeter first, following the boundary line Thomas's maps had marked. Then she made her way to the barn. The symbol on the dirt floor had been disturbed by investigators, but traces of it remained. Sarah stood in the center of the circle and tried to imagine what Daniel had felt standing here, believing he was protecting his son, not knowing he was drawing something closer. She heard it then. A sound like wind, but there was no breeze. It seemed to come from below, from the earth itself. Sarah knelt and pressed her palm against the ground. The soil was warm. It shouldn't have been. November in Texas brought cool mornings, and the barn floor should have been cold. But the earth radiated heat, like something alive and breathing underneath. Sarah stood quickly, her professional skepticism warring with a primal instinct that told her to leave. She compromised by pulling out her phone and taking photographs of the barn's interior from every angle. As she was about to leave, her flashlight caught something she'd missed before. Scratches on one of the barn's support posts, deep gouges in the wood, running vertically. Sarah moved closer and realized they were tally marks. She counted them. 26 groups of 7 marks each. 182 days. Someone had been counting days in this barn. For 6 months, someone had marked time on this post. She thought of the journal entry. They will never find the bodies. They will never understand what happened. Sarah photographed the marks and left the barn. As she walked back to her vehicle, she noticed something else she'd previously overlooked. Along the path from the barn to the house, there were depressions in the earth. Not quite holes, but places where the ground had settled slightly, creating 7 shallow divots in an arc leading from the barn. She measured the distances with her stride. Each depression was approximately 30 feet from the next. 7 points, just like the symbols Daniel had drawn. Sarah drove back to the station and immediately pulled the original crime scene photographs from 1997. She spread them across her desk, studying the images of the property taken in the days after the disappearance. The depressions weren't there. The ground had been level, which meant they'd formed sometime in the past 26 years. The earth had settled or sunk, or something beneath had created those marks from below. That evening, Sarah obtained a warrant to excavate the barn floor. If Thomas Mercer had killed Daniel and Ethan and buried them somewhere on the property, the barn was the most likely location. Despite the previous searches, they'd never dug beneath the barn itself. The excavation began the next morning. Sarah watched as workers removed the top layer of soil where the symbol had been painted. They dug down 3 feet, then 4, then 5. The soil was strange, darker than it should have been, with an oily quality that made the workers uncomfortable. At 6 feet down, they found the first bone. Sarah's heart hammered as the forensic team carefully excavated around it. But as more bones emerged, her confusion grew. These weren't human bones. They were animal bones. Cattle, horses, what looked like deer. Hundreds of bones, all jumbled together in a mass grave directly beneath where the symbol had been drawn. Dr. Oakes was called to the scene. She examined the bones with growing concern. "These have been here a long time," she said. "Some of these are old, really old. Look at the degradation patterns. I'd estimate some of these bones are over 100 years old." 100 years? Sarah repeated. "At least. And they're arranged deliberately, not randomly buried. This is a pit, a offering pit." Dr. Oakes pointed to scoring marks on some of the bones. "See these? Tool marks. These animals were butchered ritually, not for food." The excavation continued until they reached 8 feet. And there, at the very bottom of the pit, they found something that made Sarah's blood run cold. 2 sets of human bones, small and delicate, children's bones. But these weren't Daniel and Ethan. Carbon dating would later confirm these remains were approximately 130 years old, buried sometime in the late 1800s. Dr. Oakes's voice was quiet when she spoke. Jedediah Mercer had 2 children who died young, according to historical records. Twin daughters, aged 7. The records say they died of fever, but these bones show no signs of disease. Sarah looked down into the pit, at the layers of bones, at the evidence of rituals performed over more than a century. "The land takes back what it's owed," she whispered, remembering Chester Rainey's account of Daniel's last words. They never found Daniel and Ethan's bodies. Not in the pit, not anywhere on the property. As Thomas had promised, they simply weren't there. But 2 weeks later, when Sarah was reviewing footage from trail cameras the sheriff's department had installed around the property, she saw something that made her hands shake. The footage was from 2:47 a.m., captured by a camera positioned near the barn. Two figures walked across the frame. One tall, one small. A man and a boy, holding hands. They walked toward the barn, their movements stiff and wrong, like puppets being pulled by strings. As they reached the barn door, they paused. The taller figure turned toward the camera. Sarah zoomed in on the face, even though she already knew what she would see. Daniel Mercer stared into the camera with empty, black eyes. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and then he and Ethan walked into the barn and vanished. Sarah erased the footage. She told no one what she'd seen. Some things, she decided, were better left undocumented. Thomas Mercer was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder in the absence of bodies. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He accepted the verdict without emotion. When Sarah visited him in prison 3 months after the trial, he smiled at her through the reinforced glass. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked. "On the cameras. I saw them too sometimes, when I watched the farm. They're still there, Detective. They're always there. The land keeps what it takes." Sarah didn't answer. She left the prison and drove straight to Crow's Hollow Farm. The demolition had been completed while Thomas was being tried. The farmhouse and barn were gone, scraped from the earth and hauled away. The land had been leveled, prepared for sale. But as Sarah stood where the barn had once been, she felt it. That warmth rising from the earth, that sense of something vast and patient waiting just below the surface. She got in her car and drove away, and she never returned to Crow's Hollow Farm again. Patricia Mercer died in her sleep in January 2025, 14 months after Thomas's conviction. She was found in her living room, surrounded by photographs of Daniel and Ethan, a peaceful expression on her face. The autopsy revealed natural causes, a heart attack, quick and painless. But Sarah, who attended the funeral, noticed something that troubled her. In Patricia's hand, clutched so tightly it had to be pried loose, was a photograph. Not one of the family photos that had hung on her walls for decades, but a new one. Recent. It showed Patricia standing in front of Crow's Hollow Farm, or rather where the farm had once stood. The land was empty now, sold to a development company that planned to build a shopping center. Patricia stood on the bare earth, smiling, and behind her, barely visible in the background, were 2 figures, tall and small, blurred as if moving, or as if they weren't entirely there. Sarah burned the photograph in Patricia's fireplace before anyone else could see it. She told herself she was protecting the dead woman's memory, preserving her dignity. But late at night, Sarah sometimes wondered if Patricia had found what she'd been searching for all those years. If, in that moment captured by the camera, she'd been reunited with her brother and nephew. Not in this world, but in whatever lay beneath Crow's Hollow, in that place where the world was soft and the boundaries between here and there grew thin. The shopping center was never built. 3 construction workers died in accidents during the first week of site preparation, all on the exact spot where the barn had stood. The development company abandoned the project, citing unforeseen geological instability. The land went back up for sale. It remained unsold. Sometimes, late at night, drivers passing on County Road 47 report seeing lights moving across the empty field. 2 lights, one high and one low, like a man and a boy carrying lanterns through the darkness. But when the police investigate, they find nothing. Just empty land and warm earth, and the faint smell of something old and patient waiting in the soil. The Mercer farm is gone. Daniel and Ethan are gone. Thomas sits in prison, counting the days, drawing 7 pointed symbols on the walls of his cell. And beneath the earth of Brazos County, in a place where the world grows soft and the boundaries blur, something ancient continues to wait, continues to hunger, continues to take what it believes it's owed. The land remembers. The land always remembers. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rises from the creek beds and the light slants through the Texas pines, the land gives back what it has taken. Just for a moment. Just long enough to be seen. Just long enough to remind the living that some disappearances are not endings. They are only transformations.